Alright, so this is the trainer module. This is where I'll actually be able to teach the creature that I just built in the editor how to do something. So for example, I'm just going to teach it how to swim as fast as it can in whatever direction. It doesn't really matter. So in order to do that, the basic overview is that uh, the trainer will create a population of those creatures. So a certain number, let's say 50 copies of the creature body template that we just made will be created, uh, but with slight variations. And then each of those will be tested for how well they can swim. And then the ones that are better at it will survive and pass on their attributes to the next generation. And then that population of creatures will be tested in the same way. And the process just iterates like that over and over and over again. So the creatures with strategies that don't work are discarded, and the ones that are good form the basis for the next generation. So the first thing to do is create new population, and we want to grab the creature that was built earlier. Population size is just uh, what it sounds like. It's how many copies of the creature are going to be um, created each generation. Uh, I don't need to. All these other options aren't really too important. I just start with the weight zeroed, so basically start out blank without um, any randomness, and then you just create new population. Um, all right, so uh, the first thing to do is to create the actual trial so that the creatures have something to work towards. So I just go add trial, and this isn't set up very well, but because it's the first time, I just go to minigame type. And there's only one minigame currently, but I can use it for swimming. Um, this is basically the environment uh, that will determine how well it swims. This controls basically all of the environmental force, or basically the 3D environment that the creature is going to be tested in. So it's the test environment options. I can change the amount, like the viscosity of the water that the creature's in. I can add gravity if I want. Uh, I won't go through, but there are a bunch of options. I can change the um, altitude of the ground, etc. And then just hit apply to create that. Um, then I go back. So the fitness function basically defines how the creatures are evaluated. So there are a bunch of different scores, sub-scores that are added together to determine the final score. So distance from origin is basically how far the creature travels away from its starting point. So I'm going to give that maximum weight because we care about that. Energy spent is just how much it's moving its muscles. I'm going to ignore that for now. Same with distance to target. We're not going to worry about going to an actual goal location. And I'm also going to weight average speed heavily. Custom body, no. Average speed is just what it sounds like, how fast the creature moves on average. So we're going to be rewarding creatures which can make it the maximum distance away from their starting point and move as quickly as possible. That's going to be the uh, basis for the scoring. So I just apply that, uh, and then we're back where we started, but now we have a trial in place. So it says number of plays is how many times each creature is tested. Uh, if we had a more complicated test, you can up this and it will average the score of each of its attempts. And then time steps is how long in the environment it should be tested for. So I'm just going to give it, this is in frames right now. So I'll apply that. Alright, so now that we have our test and our fitness function, um, we're basically ready to test it. I'm just going to start it running so you can see what's going on. It creates the creature in the 3D environment. But right now it's not doing anything because the creatures don't have any behaviors trained yet. So it's just kind of sitting there. Um, so what's going to happen is this is generation 0, so it's going to go through all of them, and they're basically going to be about the same. But what happens at the end of that generation, some random variation is added, and that's added through this mutation panel. Uh, so there's a lot of options. I'm just going to go over the basic ones for now. Maybe in another video I can go through the intricacies of the other ones, but I'll just hit the main points. So this weight mutation rate is basically how many random variations are going to be added each generation. So the higher this is, the more different each copy of the creature is going to be. Um, so it might explore more strategies, but it's also harder to converge uh, on a good strategy because there's so much genetic noise in the population. Um, then these settings refer to the creature's brain, for lack of a better word, but it's basically just wirings between its inputs and outputs, so how it will behave based on its current inputs that it's having. And this creature basically just knows the angle of its joints, and its outputs are just bending its muscles. Um, so these settings influence what kind of or how you basically how it wires those up. It's not too important, so I'm just gonna. The main ones are add link, so this adds a connection. There's a random chance that this will add a connection from an input to an output. And remove link, I have a little bit because sometimes you don't want too many connections, or you only want connections that really give an advantage. You don't want a lot of extraneous ones, so we just kind of force that. And we'll just get started. I'll go through the other ones. So I can speed up the rate of training with these, the fast and slow buttons, or go back to normal speed, real time. I'm just gonna start it going for a little bit, because we should start to see some improvement. Um, Alright, so while that's running, uh, as it goes through the generations, we'll start to see up here a graph of its score over time. So it can be very noisy in the beginning, but over time you'll see it kind of give a more general trend. Uh, so we'll just let that run for a little bit. You can see it's getting better, but not a whole lot. It's just trying out some stuff. Um, I'll actually give it a little bit more mutation in the beginning so that I can get a jump start. Uh, Data view is a bunch of debug information, so you can kind of tell what's going on under the hood. I won't get too into it, but this shows an overview of um, the creature's wiring or brain. So you can see that it's got connections from some inputs to some outputs. In this case, it looks like it's got a connection from an oscillator input, kind of the internal clock, to its muscle. Looks like, I think, this muscle here, uh, and a bunch of other ones from the current angle. Alright, so I jumped forward in a little bit. We're at generation 38. Because basically the muscles weren't strong enough, so I used the global multiplier to increase the speed that it can move its muscles with, so it gets a little bit more power, because that was the issue. It was having a little bit of trouble getting going in the beginning, so I just made that change. So now I'm just going to fast forward it some more, so we'll actually should see the more normal curve. This is unscripted, so and I don't want to do a million takes, but this should let us know actually what's going on. I'll take a look. In the meantime, I can go over some of the other panels. So crossover basically has nothing right now. It's just one. Crossover is basically breeding, or another name for breeding. Um, so the best performers get mixed and matched with each other to create new candidates over time. And this random link is basically normally a child would inherit uh, its connections from mostly from the better performing parent, but if I crank this all the way up, it will randomly choose which parent it gets its connections from. Um, Species is a way to split up the population into subgroups so that it can try different strategies in its own protected niche. Uh, Basically allows it to explore more strategies without immediately being a lower performer and being discarded right away. Um, uh, these sliders basically just say how similar a creature is to another, and more similar creatures are grouped together. So basically, this is just a measure of how similar two creatures are, and there's a threshold for if they're above that value, then they're not considered part of that subspecies. If they're below it, then they are, and they're just added to that pool. Um, Adoption rate's kind of a poorly named thing right now, but it's basically if it's one, it will always be put into uh, the species pool that it's most closely related to based on its similarity. Um, Otherwise, it'll just automatically be placed in the species of its parent. So adoption rate at high allows for the creation of new creatures, or new species rather, more easily. And then the species size penalty basically is just the more creatures that are in a specific subspecies, uh, the worse their overall score is. So it encourages smaller, more unique species above the many of the standard ones. And interspecies mating is just will the creatures only mate with other creatures in their subspecies, or will they just go wild? And I can check that on. Why not? We can use it a little bit. I wouldn't worry too much about uh, these settings. Um, they basically just describe what uh, attributes we use to measure the similarity. In this case, I'm weighting it more heavily towards the connections in the brain, the connections between inputs and outputs, and that's what's going to determine how similar to any two creatures are. I'm going to crank adoption up and penalty to encourage more. Um, and we can see what species are currently around here. So right now there's only one species, and that will probably last for a little while. Um, all right, so now that's been going, we can see. So it's getting there. It's developing kind of a basic pattern, uh, and we can see all the different connections that it has now, and the weights between them. So it still has that original connection from the internal clock to one of its muscles, but it's been adding a bunch of other ones. All right, so I'm going to crank that up again, let it go for a little longer. Right. Um, so the final tab is body mutation. So in this case, the creature's body was entirely designed in the creature editor, but you can also randomly add mutation to the body shape. So you can add new segments, will be randomly added on while it's testing. You can change the proportions of all the segments. Can actually do that right now to show, so that's an easy one. Um, and we should start to see variations in length and width, etc. Attach settings just determines how a segment is attached to its parent, and its initial rest angle. So we should start to see some variation in the body over time using that. Um, that's the meat of it. The training modifiers aren't too important. It's basically just used to automatically control something like I can scale down all the mutation rates uniformly over time without having to incrementally do this and apply, do this, apply. I can just set it up to automatically do it. So I'll actually go for that right now just to show it. So this is how many generations it will go from its current settings to some minimum multiplier. And I'll just add that. So now it started at generation 86. It's going to go for about 60. So around 145 or so, it should be at that minimum value, and you'll start to see the fitness graph level off because it's not getting any new changes to work with. It's just running basically the same strategies over and over again. Uh, yeah, so I can give it a little bit more time also so that it can test how it does over a longer duration. Um, let's see. Yeah, we can see if the species has taken off. Alright, it has. Now there are two separate subspecies. I can even make that more likely to happen by dropping the threshold. So we should see uh, more species as a result of this in general. Um, I'm not going to let it go too much longer, but I'll probably at least get to around 140 and then stop the stream, or recording rather. That's not that cool. Alright, and I'll crank up this stuff just so you can see it. Uh, and also, why not add a little some other segment stuff because it doesn't really matter. Um, just add some body mutation for fun. In the meantime, I can go over some of the other data displays. This one, as you've seen before, it's what the current subspecies are, how many of each creature is in them. So right now there's species 2 is by far dominant with most of the creatures, but you'll see some new ones be created. The next one is each individual agent. Sorry, that's really hard to see. It's just, yeah, you're just sorry for anyone who has epilepsy. Uh, but this one basically shows each agent's brain. These are all the inputs and outputs, what they are, um, their current value. It's disabled because it's running so fast, and then the connections between them. Uh, this is just the connections, so you can see only those. Um, gene links is basically the current links in the population. So you can kind of see the variety of wirings from inputs to outputs. There are a number of very established links that almost every creature has, and then there are some recently mutated ones that are just being tried. So you can kind of see this number is the historical marker of uh, what mutation number it was. So there have been at least 1,100 mutations so far, connecting inputs to outputs. Uh, and you can kind of see when each one really became established. So at generation 60, this connection uh, was created, and now every member of the population has it. So that was clearly uh, a very advantageous one. Um, Whereas one of these is just recently created, and time will tell how important that one is. All right. This just shows all the agents, or sorry, all the creatures. You can just use those words interchangeably. How many total inputs and outputs and connections they have. So most of them have about 15 or so connections. Um, and then this just shows another view of the wiring diagram. Um, it's not, yeah. Uh, this just shows the body plan. So it's got its root segment. Um, it's basically it's copied one. Another the tail one, and it looks like this guy also added a segment somewhere. I think it looks like on top of the head, so it actually like added a nose or something. Um, Actually, yeah, let's take a look at that. Yeah, it looks like so it added a new segment at the front uh, due to the body mutation. Um, so I guess that helped it get some length. Length is important. All right. Where was I? Body genome. All right. So the next one is actual fitness scores. So in real time, it's showing what it's being scored uh, based on each of the test components, for lack of a better word. I call them fitness components. So distance from origin, higher numbers better. Same with average speed. Uh, then this shows what last generation scores were for each agent or each creature. Uh, and then this is the average for the whole generation. So you can kind of see that the average speed was about 1.5 last generation. We can kind of see that change when this gets to the next generation. All right, so it's pretty much the same, but you can kind of see that here because the fitness graph is kind of plateaued, mostly because I added a bunch of uh, weird mutation that's kind of complicating everything. Uh, it can be hard to find the right balance between too much mutation and not enough because both have their own problems. So a lot of it is just tuning those rates properly. Uh, I'm actually going to reduce the body mutation now. Um, so over 2 generations, it will go from its current values to 0. And you can see that reflected there. Then we can actually take a look at what it's gotten to. Uh, or I can scale down the mutation to almost nothing and really refine what the total outcome was. And then this was the last uh, data view. Basically shows all the different fitness scores for the creatures of last generation. So it should range from 0 to 1. Zero, this guy was the worst last generation, and you can't see the best one. Oh, there he is. Because it cuts off, and there were I believe 60 creatures, and it only shows 42 right now. But last generation number 25 was the best one, and you can see now that I lowered the body mutation. The average score kind of went up, and that's mostly because uh, the mutations are random, so a lot of them are going to be disadvantageous, and then that brings down the average score. Um, so when you lower mutation, you can generally get a temporary boost in performance. But if you lower it too much, then all the creatures are the same, and it's not really testing anything new. So we're coming up on the end here. I'll stop it at 150 generations just to show what kind of happened. Um, we can see that the original species went extinct, so you can kind of tell that progress was made. Because these species 5 and 8 clearly outperformed it enough that the original species was, well, extinct. Right. I'll turn that off. Fitness function to leave alone. Um, and then I'll turn up the training duration for a bit right after, or right before it. I go back to real-time speed to see what's actually going on. I don't suspect that it's changed its behavior too much, but it should have refined it a lot. It also looks like it really extended its um, nose or head segment. Uh, Probably the extra length gave it like a cheap way to move faster, and it's just exploiting that. Um, 'Cause it doesn't really have any knowledge of what it looks like. It's really just trying things kind of at random. Um, and then if those work, that gets passed on to the next generation, and oftentimes that will get combined with other uh, successful mutations, and you'll have eventually something that actually works. Evolution is magic. All right, almost there. Sorry for the view. It's one of the things I definitely want to change is less spastic view for the speed up. Alright, here we go. Alright, so this is basically what it's come to after 150 generations. Each individual is going to be a little different. They should be pretty similar at this point. Uh, but you can kind of see it's kind of settled on this overall basic sine wave strategy. And it added one segment at the front for fun. So this creature has 20 connections between its inputs and outputs. Looks like it still has that original connection from the oscillator to its motor, um, but it's got a bunch of others too. Uh, Looks like it connected that oscillator to almost all of its other muscles as well. Uh, it seems like a pretty common strategy. It's got, yeah, um, but also has some angles. Oh, right, actually, this one it looks like it during the body mutation it gave itself um, some other oscillators, and it's ended up using those as well. Kind of interesting. All right, well, may not have been the most interesting example, but hopefully this shows the general outline of how to train a creature. You could get wildly different results by varying the game options and the fitness options. It wouldn't have been very interesting, but I could have rewarded it staying by the origin by um, actually flipping this checkbox, which would make small values preferable. Um, and it would have tried to move as quickly as it could because average speed is still up, but also try to stay near the origin. And I'll actually just try that now. We'll see. if we can get anything kind of interesting. I'll add a lot of mutation just for fun. All right, so I'm training it with this kind of inverted um, fitness function now, just to kind of see what happens. It's already a pretty established. Should I change the wrong one? I'll just remove body mutation first. Slow it down a little. Hitting the limits. Yep. Well, this will be interesting. It's got we gave it some other weird body mutations to play with. Um, we'll see how well those work. I'm going to zoom in the graph so we can actually see what's going on. Because it renormalized the score because it remembers all of the scores of the previous generations and remaps the graph based on that. Now that I've flipped distance from origin, so now I want to reward those that stay closer to the origin and reward those that move quickly. So I'm guessing that they'll try to find some behavior that balances those two, maybe by kind of swimming in a circle. We'll actually see if those short ones can do it better than uh, the original body plan. And I'll just give a new mutation. Just give it about 50. Alright, you can see it's changing already. Looks like it's figuring something out. It's making a lot of progress recently. And it does look like it's kind of spinning around in a circle, sort of like I thought it might. Yep. Somehow I don't think that body plan's gonna survive. Which species is this? Alright, so these are the species 18, 19. Well, let's find out. Let's give it a little bit more. Yeah, I'd place my money on that. Alright, I'll give it a couple more generations just so you get the point. Um, but that's mostly it. Let's see. Oh yeah, so I can go over uh, these two options. Survival rate is the percentage of the population that will performed well enough that it just gets a free ticket to the next generation. So it just is placed there as is. So right now, about 3% of the population just goes on to the next one automatically based on being really good. And then breeding rate is the percentage of the population that's allowed to pass on its genes or attributes. So right now it's about 85%. That's mostly so that you get even the kind of crappy ones might sometimes have an adaptation that's useful. So I like to have that pretty high. I should almost have it all the way, but sometimes the really shitty ones don't really deserve to make it. Then Yeah, I'll get into that in another video because the brain can be a little bit more complicated to go over conceptually. Uh, Leave the species and body mutations off. You can see we've got a couple of new species, subspecies also uh, coming in. And then I'll just give it a little bit more time here. Does look like this was the strategy that kind of is going to come out on top, though. Alright, that's probably about enough. Let's take a look. Yeah, that's pretty much what I expected it to do. It wants to move, but it wants to stay around the origin, so it basically curled itself up into a ball and swims around in a circle. But it's a good example of how you can change the behavior drastically based on how you score, how you choose to reward or punish the creatures. All right. Until next time.